Well, welcome to the 2020 Walk of Hope virtual. We appreciate your participation in the midst of all these changes that are going on this year and all the different setbacks, but we really appreciate you coming out today and showing your support. As we all can realize, this is a solemn time. It's time to remember loved ones who have either been impacted by suicide or may have died by suicide. It's also a time for you not to be alone during the grieving process. It's a time for you to remember that you're not alone in the midst of your struggle and the darkness of mental illness and different types of setbacks. And it's also a time period for hope and a time for togetherness, and it's a time for awareness. You are not alone in the midst of this darkness. There is light and there is hope. As many of you know, suicide is the second leading cause of death for young adults, and it's the 10th leading cause of death for all ages and all demographics. I have been a counselor since 1990, and unfortunately in October of 2015, my son and I were at a funeral of the third of his classmates of 100. He graduated from a small private school in northern Illinois, and 3 of his classmates had died as a result of suicide. And due to that, I knew that I had to do something more, that just being a counselor was not enough. And I reached out to some individuals in the community, and we started an organization which then evolved into a nonprofit called Shatter Our Silence. We believe that there is a silence that is for all of us around the factors that lead to suicide, specifically young adult suicide. So the mission of Shatter Our Silence is to increase awareness and educate individuals specifically young adults, significant others, and the professionals that work with them on the factors that lead to young adult suicide. But today, I want to specifically talk to you about another topic. I want to talk to you about a topic of resiliency. Resiliency, I believe, is one of those tools, one of those things that we can develop. No individual is born with resiliency. Resiliency is developed over time, and it is developed as we go through hardships. There is an organization called the International Committee for the Study of Victimization, and they, in the midst of their study, they said that individuals who have faced some type of adversity will fall into one of 3 categories. One, that individuals that face adversity, they may fall into this category of being permanently dispirited. In other words, broken and never heal or recover. The second category of people that they somehow, and I don't really know how this happens, but they get back to normal as if something never really happened. And then that third category is the individuals that it was a defining moment in their life. It's not that they necessarily are grateful that it happened. They grieved whatever the loss was, whatever the adversity that they had. But because of this event, they then found meaning and fulfillment in their life, or a purpose in their life that they wouldn't have if this event wouldn't have happened. This is what door number 3 is, what I'm going to invite you into during the midst of this talk. That resiliency allows us that not just that we get knocked down, but that we stand back up after we get knocked down, and that we learn from what had happened as we get knocked down, and we learned about something inside us that maybe is even greater than we ever thought it was, that may have come out of this particular loss or this particular setback. The idea that we all suffer, that each and every one of us at some point will suffer, and throughout our lives we're going to suffer. Now, this idea of suffering is based upon our perception of our reality. Each of us perceives something a little bit different about what suffering is. So we can't really compare someone's suffering to someone else's, and it wouldn't be do us any good if we then looked at that I have suffered more than someone else, because each of us have our own experience with suffering. But this I know for sure is that if you do not transform your pain, you will almost certainly transmit it. Let me me say that again. If you do not transform as a result of your pain or suffering, you will almost certainly transmit it. This was a quote by Richard Rohr, and I believe that has come true at different times in my life when I may not have looked at my pain, kind of suppressed it and pushed it down, and then come to find out that in some way it comes out sideways, either through fear and avoidance or agitation and anger. But when I take the time and do the work to look at that pain and the suffering and what caused it and the circumstances, that I know that I then have the opportunity to transform. What can we control? Well, what we know is that we can control our thoughts and we can control our actions. We can't necessarily control what happens, and many of you have been in this situation that you can't control your circumstances and you can't control what someone else's actions are. But what we can do is we can control our response to that. Actually, it is our responsibility to control our responses to that. First, it has to be with our thoughts, that we have a mindset of that this is the part that I can control, and then take appropriate action in that way. This idea of how do I turn the obstacles in my life into an opportunity. This was taught to me a while ago as I studied the philosophy of Stoicism. This idea that when obstacles occur in my life, first of all, not be shocked that they have occurred. Obstacles will occur on your journey, but that instead of them being a nuisance or an annoyance of being there, that they can be an opportunity for growth. One way of doing that is I first have to focus on what is it that I can control and accept what I can't control. For the individuals that are listening that are from Central South Dakota, you know this as well as anybody. You know that depending on the time of year and the weather that goes along with that time of year, you know very well that you can't control the weather. But you do have a choice about how that you're going to dress appropriately. Because what you wear in Central South Dakota in August is not necessarily appropriate for you to wear in February or January. So I think that is a small example of recognizing that no matter what I want, no matter what I can do, is I can't control certain things. I can't control the weather, but I can control my response to that. I think the organizers of this walk has done another great example of that. We can't control the pandemic and the effects of that, but we can be diligent and continue to have this walk, even though it isn't exactly how we would want it to be and how it has been for the last years that you've done this, but we can make adaptations, and that is the part that we can control. The idea that when an obstacle comes, and the greater the obstacle when it comes, it's the greater opportunity for growth. So when we have a small obstacle, there's maybe a little opportunity for growth. But when there is a larger storm in our life, this is when we have a greater opportunity for growth, and that is that personal growth. If we think of a captain of a ship, or maybe a captain of an airplane, for me, I will want the captain of the airplane that I'm on to make sure that they have faced many storms and many turbulences before I got on the plane, because I don't want them to learn that while I'm on the plane for the first time. I believe that a good captain or a great captain is when they faced those storms in their life. That's how they learn how to be that great captain. They won't happen in smooth seas or calm airways. And one of the last things that I think that we can learn about obstacles that are in our life is that we get to decide what story that we're going to tell ourselves. this idea that we get to decide the story came first to me, not only as introduced to me as I read about Stoicism, but 3 years ago, I was with my son on a weekend hiking trip. We had ventured out from northern Illinois out to Colorado, and we were going to do some hiking. And the weekend went just as planned at the beginning of the weekend, and we had gone hiking and gone on a couple different trails, and it was now Saturday morning, and it was right after breakfast. We were heading up to the Continental Divide to see a place that my son had not seen, and as we were driving off to the side of the road, there was a sign, and so we pulled off, and the sign said "Easy Path, 1.2 miles." I said to Caleb, my son, I said, let's go ahead and try it, and we went up the hill without necessarily even taking our backpack or even thinking much about it. The path was easy, just as the sign said, and it was the 1.2 miles as it said. And just as we crest the top of that, the top of the trail was that beautiful. And if you've ever been out in the mountains, you see that beautiful lake with the background of the mountain there. And unfortunately, because of the angle where the trail ended, we couldn't get a great view of the mountains. So my son said, "Hey, Dad, if we cross this little stream here that has some logs on it and climb those rocks, we'll probably get a better view," because some trees were covering where we were at. So off we went, and my son, being a former football player, he was moving like a mountain goat or something, just gracefully going through. Me being a little bit older, I was being a little bit more cautious. And as we were going through there, these boulders that we were climbing, found out later it's called bouldering, that I was climbing down, and as I went down one of these boulders, my left leg went through, and as I was bringing my right leg through that as well, my boot got caught, and I started going headfirst into the boulders. I had pulled back and ended up finding myself laying down on the ground. I stood up quickly because I was embarrassed and didn't want any of the squirrels or wildlife out there to see that I had fallen, and I noticed that blood was gushing from my left shin, and my right knee was the size of a large cantaloupe. I could stand on it and I could bend it, but when I pressed off it, I fell backwards. After a little bit, my son came back and saw that I wasn't moving. He saw the blood, and he eventually helped me as we tried to navigate through those rocks. It was about 45 minutes as we navigated through, and I had fallen a couple more times. Found out later that contributed to what had happened. Long story short, the mountain team came up and rescued me. I was brought to Aspen to have emergency surgery. By the way, if you ever have a joint injury, a shoulder or knee, Aspen is by far the best place to have that done. They do a great job. The surgery was a success. A couple days later, I ventured back via plane back to Rockford, my hometown in northern Illinois, and I met the doctor at the end of the week. He was a doctor that I had worked with before when I was coaching. He looked at the surgery, I explained what happened to him, and he says, "Kevin, it looks like everything is done well." And he explained to me what rehab would look like and everything. And he said, "Kevin, if you do everything that they tell you to do in rehab, and I know you will, that in 12 weeks your leg will be completely healed. And even though you had an almost complete quadricep tendon rupture, you will be completely healed and almost back to normal within 12 weeks." I didn't think much of that at the time, but that little seed stayed with me. And in the midst of 6 weeks of having my leg completely locked out and not being able to drive for 8 weeks, and in the midst of all the things of up and down, doing that initial rehab physically as well as emotionally, that remembrance of what he had told me, what that physician had told me, is that by October, which would be the 12-week mark, my leg would be completely healed if I continued to do the work that I needed to rehab my leg. I get to decide the story that I tell in October is what I vow to. I get to decide the story that I tell others about how I handled July. So from that standpoint, I remembered many times as I had ups and downs during that time period emotionally and being upset, and I could decide how long I would stay upset or how long I might stay angry or sad or fearful, whatever it may be, because I wanted to determine the story that I was going to tell in October. This is what I would invite you into as well. Just as door number 3, where you can use your loss and use your setback to be a defining moment in your life, to allow it to give a different kind of meaning to your life. Not that it's going to replace your loved one. Not that it's going to somehow be better that they may not be here, but it is going to be a way to find a meaning that you wouldn't have had if it wouldn't have happened. You get to decide the story that you tell because of the setback or the obstacles in your way. As a former athlete, I came to realize over the years of being a competitive athlete on the football and the wrestling and bodybuilding stage is that winning is less about the place that you get or the trophy that you get. It's more about making sure that you rise each time that you fall. The idea that we will get knocked down in life, it's part of life. It's about the story that we tell ourselves, the grit that we have as we rise every time we fall. This is what I would invite you into, that you can, when you have those setbacks, regardless if it's a personal within your own life or if the actions of someone else, that you will be able to tell the story of rising based upon the obstacle in your life, and then what meaning you created from that you wouldn't have had if it would have never happened. Thank you very much. Enjoy your walk. Celebrate and honor your loved one. Honor the fact that you're on this journey, and recognize that always there is light, there is hope in the darkness.